They stayed in their home ranges whenever possible, even when they were run by dogs. Like when we identified that a particular deer was being run by dogs, they tried to stay in their home range. And then if they got bounced out of their home range, they were back in their home range within 24 hours. They have a really high sight fidelity. So even if they're getting pushed, and study after study shows that when a deer gets bounced out of an area, they're only running like at most 200 yards. And then they're just calming down and they want to get back to where they were. They establish a home range and they maintain that home range. And even in dog hunting, bucks that were instrumented, they try to maintain that home range. If they got bounced out of it, they return pretty quickly. They're going to get back to that bedding area usually within 13 hours is what the exact metric we found was in South Carolina. So you might as well go hunting the next day. And you can think about most hunters, it's like, oh, I bounced those deer, I'm not going to go back, I'm going to give it some rest. Those deer are back right in there.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman podcast. Today, we're coming at you once again from Athens, Georgia, at the headquarters, temporary headquarters, as Brian told us, of Georgia Outdoor News. Today, we got another biologist on who we're extremely excited to talk to. Today, we're talking to Dr. Gino D'Angelo, Associate Professor of Deer Ecology Management here at the University of Georgia. Gino, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, guys. Looking forward to the fall.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk to you, man. I was initially talking to Brian about coming over here to interview him about, antlers and everything and get Dr. Carl Miller on as well. And he's like, hey, there's this other guy over here you could get on too. And, I'll get him to send over a list of topics. I'm like, okay. And then you sent the topic list over, and when I saw it, I was like, woo, this sounds very interesting. We also got Jacob here. Jacob, how are you?
Doing well, real well. Having some great conversations so far. It's going to be a busy day, just with a bunch of interviews. But, Gino, super excited to talk to you. Can you give us a little rundown of, I guess a big topic we're going to talk about specifically is the population decline in North Georgia in the mountains. Can you give us a little rundown on kind of what's been happening there and kind of what's going on, and we'll kind of maybe baseline what the topic's going to be that we're going to be discussing?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be talking about a population decline of white-tailed deer. It's in the Appalachian Mountains, so we're in the southern fringe of the Appalachians. Populations where folks used to travel far and wide to go to the mountains and have that mountain experience. We've seen deer populations decline, but also hunter participation decline. And so we conducted a large study to investigate why that deer population's been declining, how we might be able to fix it and retain those hunters, and also just improve the hunting experience for folks traveling to that area. And it was a great opportunity for me. I'm from the Appalachians of Pennsylvania. And so to see a population like that in decline, and a hunter myself, public land hunter, it just really sparked my interest, and it's a need that Georgia DNR had to improve the situation.
Yeah, definitely. On that topic list, there was, I think we saw something about black bears and predation when it comes to deer in northern Georgia specifically, and then also y'all actually tracked hunter movements via GPS on firearms hunts to see how the hunters moved. And you also had GPS collar does to watch how does reacted to that hunting pressure, which is super interesting. I'm very excited to get into that as well.
I was going to kind of start. Can you give us some history on when this population decline was starting to get noticed? Like, how long has this been going on?
Yeah, Georgia DNR had great harvest data because they're check-in hunts, so folks bring their deer to a check station. And so from 1979 all the way to the 2010s, so 2015 or so, is when they track these populations, seeing in particular a decline in the mid to late 2000s. And so this decline, by the way, I'm going to, spoiler alert, it coincided with changes in forest harvest. And so national forests are designed to provide multiple use, hunting being one of them, but also timber harvest and dirt biking, fishing, and all that. And so there have been drastic declines in timber harvest, which leads to poor habitat conditions. And that's what really led to this project, is to understand how these habitats might be impacting deer populations. And so having these great sources of harvest data on deer, it allowed Georgia DNR to understand that something was going on, and it had been for some time. And so that harvest data on 8 wildlife management areas, which comprised hundreds of thousands of acres, showed that it wasn't just some anomaly like, some freak thing on one WMA. It was all of them in the Appalachians showing these declines.
Okay. So the timber harvest thing is a bit controversial, right?
Very.
Because there's a couple instances just fresh in my mind, specifically up in Tennessee, that a buddy of ours was pretty involved with. I forgot the name of the WMA up there, but they were talking about doing some like kind of prairie grassland restoration, and so they were going to cut a lot of hardwoods. And the deer hunters came out of the woodworks mad about it. I mean, like ready to fight. And it eventually was kind of shot down, and so they're not doing it. Do you remember the name? Bridgestone.
WMA.
And because there's this perception of like, when you cut the oak trees down, it's going to totally screw up your deer hunting. We just talked about that with Brian and all them on our previous podcast that the listeners probably heard a couple weeks ago. But can you talk about that a little bit, where the timber dynamics of the national forest, like these big woods, Appalachian mountain settings, how the removal of timber harvest actually kind of screwed things up?
Absolutely, yeah. So, I mean, these areas would have supported large lumber mills, and communities would have thrived because of that business that would have been in an area. And so we're talking about areas that are on U.S. Forest Service property, so national forests, but these wildlife management areas are managed by the state agency, so Georgia DNR. The U.S. Forest Service controls all of the timber management, but Georgia DNR can only implement hunts, and they can do some food plot work, etc. So it lies with the U.S. Forest Service. And over time, I mean, there were some changes in demand for forest products, but also environmental rights groups, including Forest Watch in North Georgia, they have come in, and every time the U.S. Forest Service posts for public comment that they're going to do some habitat management and timber harvest, Forest Watch and other environmental rights groups protest it, and they get legal with it through the Southern Environmental Law Center. And so they've got a big lobbyist organization, they've got a legal component, and they challenge these timber harvests, and they've essentially shut down logging in these areas. And for most listeners that are hunters, we understand that timber harvest can improve habitat. I mean, we all love to find great bedding areas and forage areas that are created through clear cuts. But to a lot of people, clear cuts and timber harvest are really dirty words. And one of the strategies that this Forest Watch organization takes is they try to have many areas designated as old growth forest. And what we're actually looking at are forests that were harvested at some point. It could be 1 to 2 centuries ago. They're not virgin forests, but the more areas that they could find and encourage and essentially bully the Forest Service into designating as old growth, those areas will never be cut. And so that's one of their big strategies beyond just protesting every timber harvest. So what we see is if a timber harvest is slated to occur and it's going to be like 3,000 acres, through legal action it'll be winnowed down to several hundred acres. Or it'll be a minor thinning, or an operation where just a few select trees will be taken out. And so over time this has eroded the ability to harvest these areas, and it's eroded the economy in the area, so that now mills are gone and there's not demand for forest products. So even though today the Forest Service is ramping up some harvests, particularly in the Piedmont versus in the foothills and the mountains of Georgia, they're still having trouble getting those products to mill. Some of them in pine lands, for instance, the pines are over the size that the mill can accept. And so we're in a really tough spot right now. So you'll see the Forest Service trying to get some habitat on the ground, and some of those trees get cut and they lay. They don't go to the mill.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah.
What is it about the Appalachian Mountains, and specifically North Georgia, that attracts these environmental groups that get all hot and bothered about timber cutting? Because in Alabama, we have national forests, and they cut them, buddy. I mean, they cut them. And it's awesome.
It warms my heart to see it cut. And also I have a pack of beagles, so to find those areas to rabbit hunt.
Dude, we're going to get along just fine.
Yeah.
I've known you for like 10 minutes. I already love you.
I should have brought my pup, Penny. She could have sat right here. But it's heartwarming to see it cut, but unfortunately my heart's not warmed too often nowadays on public land. But what draws folks to North Georgia? They're just north of Atlanta, so a huge population center, greater than 5 million people. And what's sprung up since the 1970s and particularly in the 80s are these resort communities in North Georgia, people that want a mountain living experience. I was just at one last week that's having some issues with overabundant deer. So here we are, overabundant deer in the mountains adjacent to national forests where we're seeing declining deer populations. Now, I won't get into all the differences there, but these communities, which have golf courses, landscaping, etc., they're embedded in the mountains. So these contractors are able to build houses into the mountainside. And so these folks retire there from all across the country, but particularly Atlanta and Chattanooga, et cetera. And once they're in the mountains, they want things to do. They want to hike. They want to get involved. They want a network of people. And they have a lot of time because they're retired. And they join a group like Forest Watch. And they honestly don't know the difference between conservation and preservation, and that timber harvest can be good for wildlife species. And so their involvement becomes this new passion to stop cutting of forests.
So, I mean, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, probably well-meaning people, but just ill-informed on like the implications of what they're advocating for, right?
Absolutely. Don't tell Forest Watch, but I'm on their newsletter, so I receive all the information that they're
Keep your enemies close.
yeah. And it's great. It's like, come on out. We're gonna hike, such and such mountain, and we're gonna learn about plants. We're gonna see some old growth forest. Along the way, we'll pull some invasive plants. You can bring a dog if it's well behaved. We're gonna have lunch at the lake. Sounds great. If I was retired, yeah, I get to interact with people and all that. But then these people become mobilized, and their money becomes mobilized for other purposes. And that leads to where we're talking about deer populations that, deer can't make a living, essentially, and support their fawns because there's just not enough forage on the ground.
Could you talk about some of the history of timber practices, specifically in the Appalachian Mountains, and also change of habitat in the last, I don't know how much history we have, maybe the last couple hundred years of how some of that's changed? Has it always been kind of like bigger timber? Was it ever like more savanna? Like what's the history of it, and how has that practice been, I guess, cultivated, that timber been cultivated for the last 100+ years?
Sure. And well, we shot ourselves in the foot by over harvest, and then of course following a lot of these large scale timber harvests, we'd see explosive fires, whether from railroad sparks or actually being lit or charcoal production. And so extreme timber harvest on a grand scale coupled with these catastrophic fires really decreased most habitats by the turn of the 20th century. And so we saw deer populations that were over-harvested by market hunting prior to that, and then over-harvest dog hunting, which is good, but in the sense it was used for the market. And so what we saw was areas that were over-harvested, they were degraded through extreme fires, and they regenerated. And then through the early 1900s, we had more modern forestry practices and timber extraction, both pine and hardwoods, going to the mills. And it was more responsible. I mean, reasonable size, clear cuts, etc. We wouldn't have seen a lot of savanna. We would have seen some of that more in the foothills and in cove areas where people would have settled. Some of those areas would have been maintained thousands of years by Native Americans through prescribed fire. Prescribed fire was removed from the landscape as well, leading to trees that are more accepting of conditions that don't have fire, and so winning out over oaks and other hardwoods that can live through fire. And so change through uses as well as reduction of habitat practices, including prescribed fire.
Interesting. Okay, and then when it came, what was the peak of deer harvest in like that setting, specifically in Georgia?
Yeah, our graph isn't complete. Starting in 1979, having really good harvest data, but it would have increased in the 80s and early 90s, and which I have to say, as a boy in Pennsylvania, that's what we saw, as deer populations were booming in the early 90s, and it mimicked it here. And then that decrease would have come especially in the early 2000s when timber harvest also dropped out. So we were able to work. Andy Little was a researcher we were working with when he was here at Georgia, and he worked closely with the Forest Service to obtain their harvest data. And what we saw was, in actual standing timber, what we saw was the amount of young forest went from being a really primary component of these ecosystems. So, maybe even 30% young forest, indicative of forest harvest. We went from that to now 1% or less of the entire landscape of these national forests is young forest. And so very little early successional habitats, few meadow areas, little regenerating forest.
Is this a common, I guess, is this a common situation in other states where the Appalachian Mountains run through, as in like lack of timber harvest and lowering of really deer population?
Absolutely. So across the Appalachian chain, mainly being owned by the U.S. Forest Service, and this reduction in management and timber harvest. In fact, the retired deer biologist Matt Knox in Virginia was sounding the alarm much earlier than this on national forest, and he penned a series of articles. I think they were called Your National Wastelands. And yeah, you can look at it and say, wow, look at all these beautiful big trees, these hardwoods, but look at the understory. Nothing, or mountain laurel and rhododendron, depending on what slopes you're on, and just little quality for wildlife, not just deer, but songbirds, small mammals, etc. And some species that are imperiled because of those habitats being non-existent.
Rough grouse being one of those.
Yeah, absolutely. We went from where you can go and have a several grouse day and many flushes to where people go to the North Georgia mountains to maybe find one grouse a season. And I know growing up in grouse country too, it was like they'd sit on a limb next to you while you're bow hunting. Like, do I want to ruin my deer hunt and take a shot at this thing? They're so delicious though.
Yeah.
But they were so common. I mean, that's indicative of change. And those rough grouse rely on different stages of forest growth. Not just those overstory trees, but mid-story and understory for nesting, for getting buds off of trees, for the insects that help them to proliferate in population. When that's all gone, yeah, that's an indicator that something's different.
Interesting.
Hunting unicorns, those rough grouse. It's like hunting a unicorn. That's what our buddy Nick says in East Tennessee. So yeah, that's we're kind of talking about timber policy, a little bit of politics here. And what does that have to do with your deer hunting? But I mean, it has to do with the carrying capacity of the landscape, right? Because you're saying all these young forests are gone and now it's a percentage or less. Can you talk about, just go a little bit deeper on the role that young forest plays for whitetails, not even from a food standpoint, but also like fawn and cover, things of that nature?
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. So the fawns, they're considered they've got a hider strategy. So early in life, those first 30 days in particular, they need that cover to bed in. And what's also important regarding that cover of where fawns bed is that mom is in the local area trying to get enough groceries to produce enough milk. And if she can't get enough food to produce milk, she produces milk of the same quality but less volume. And so if you and your brother or sister are twins and one's a little stronger, you're going to get more milk and the other one's going to fade away. And that's literally what we see in these populations is fawns that are, they're falling off due to abandonment and malnutrition. And so that cover is really important to protect those fawns to provide them with seclusion against predators, because what we see in these Appalachian regions right now is that black bears are extremely successful in getting fawns. They have these little protein packets that they can eat in the spring, and not to mention how well coyotes are doing. But by not having cover, it makes it just so much easier. Like if you were in a shopping spree, right, and you run into the grocery store and there's a bunch of hurdles, you're going to be slowed down, right, getting that whatever, maybe your brisket, right, and filling your cart with pork loin, whatever it may be. But if you're a predator and you can just course through the landscape and you're scanning, you're smelling, and all you need to do is look over these old logs and find a fawn, it's a much different story versus going through complex habitats that are taller than you and extremely dense and overlapping. It's just like running a track race, and along the way they get to pick up fawns.
That, but also not having enough buffer prey species as well to kind of take some of that pressure off. Like you talk about rabbits, It's like I'm sure the rabbit population is not doing great up there. And you talk about food sources for coyotes and
There's
stuff
like
like
two
that.
rabbits up there.
Yeah, and it's but we because we've had a couple habitat managers come on talking about like the importance of having buffer species, like prey species specifically for coyotes and bobcats, that hopefully kind of takes like that along with trapping and everything. They kind of take some of that pressure off the fawns,
Right.
and so on. But it's like in an environment like that, there's probably not an abundance of other options for specifically talking like coyotes for them to necessarily feed on.
Yeah, and they're not just carnivores either. We did a diet study in South Carolina with South Carolina DNR, and these coyotes, they're eating a lot of plant matter, including soft mast. And think about bears. It's easy for a bear to sit in a stand of blackberries and gorge itself. It's kind of hard to go around and have to maybe chase down a fawn and fight off mom to a degree. Not that she's probably attacking bears, but she comes in and intimidates. And so you have these costs where predators are having to work a lot harder, and they're more apt to find that protein in a fawn versus trying to eat a bunch of plant matter or the small mammals that occur in there and the bird eggs, etc.
Yeah. How much does it affect also just antler quality of bucks? We just had a discussion, again, listeners would have heard it a couple weeks ago with Brian Murphy about everything antlers, like genetics, nutrition, age, all the things that factor into that. In these big closed canopy, non-diverse landscapes, what does that do long-term to antler quality? Or does it not have as much of an effect because all the deer are dying, so there's not as many mouths to feed?
Now, are you reading our research? Are you coming up with these leading questions, or are you just thinking in your own brain?
Hey, man, I've just interviewed a lot of guys.
That's pretty good. Well, interestingly, along with these harvest data, Georgia DNR has done a good job of getting biological data on deer. And young males are a good index toward population health. And young males were in higher weights than they were in previous decades. Their antler mass was greater based on the circumference of their antlers, more points. And so fewer mouths to feed, you're right, Andrew, leads to deer that are in better health. So now we have a mountain hunting experience where hunters can go and see no or few deer, but they might be able to harvest a nice buck.
Yeah, that tracks because there's a place in Alabama. I'm not going to say the name of it, but everybody knows where it is. That my whole life has been like that. It's traditionally been the low deer density part of the state where you go to kill the big giant bucks. It's like you go up there, like where we hunt, you might see a couple bucks a year, like whatever. Growing up, if you go up there, you might see one buck a year, but it'll be a really good one. That was kind of like what everyone said about it. And so it seems like that kind of holds true, in different states that we've been to as well. And also some of the better deer hunters that we know, or I'm not going to say some of the better deer hunters we know, some of the deer hunters we know who kill the biggest deer the most consistently hunt in areas like that have a lower deer density and a better age class. Because I wonder if, it's so hard to hunt those areas because it's such a low deer density. Like, I guess we're about to get into this. So the hunter effort part of it, maybe some of those deer are also getting to older age classes because it's like, how many times are you going to go and not see anything? Like you're going to go home, your wife's like, what are you doing?
Or climb that mountain or drop down this valley and go to the other side.
Yep, that's right.
Access.
Which, by the way, in 2018, Georgia DNR removed the ability to kill antlerless deer on these properties because deer population, we were still studying the populations, but it was clear where things were headed. And so you're going to the mountains and you can't even shoot a doe to take home. That's when your wife's really looking and, saying, where were you again? Let me see your track log.
Yeah, but add me on Find My Friends. So let's talk about the hunter effort aspect of it. So deer populations are declining, harvest numbers declining. What about hunter participation in these areas?
Right, yeah, and something else I didn't have on my list of topics was hunter satisfaction. And so what we saw was that hunter participation went way down. I can't remember exactly. I believe it's 70% or something like that. And so you're talking about an area where families across generations would have gone to set up deer camp, sometimes for an extended period of time. Think of all those interactions that you have with, your granddad and your aunts, uncles, whatever it may be. That's gone away. And so you've got these more singleton hunters moving to these areas and going for an abbreviated hunt, and so we have less participation. And we also polled those hunters about their satisfaction, and what we saw is that they just want to see some deer. Actually, they'd love to harvest a buck, they'd love to harvest a deer, but they go to the mountains for a mountain experience. They're still going to have it because the areas are beautiful, but their satisfaction could be vastly improved just by being able to see deer and possibly harvest a buck.
Okay. And so there's just less people doing that now, or?
Yeah, so they tracked hunter numbers because these, again, are hunts where folks are checking in, and hunter numbers declined almost in concert with deer harvest numbers. And some might say, well, is it because there are fewer hunters? Well, success rates are relatively similar, so deer per hunter, but the hunter numbers are less.
Okay, I gotcha. Interesting. Yeah, that doesn't sound great. I mean,
no, well, I mean, it's great if, by the way, you want to go up there and not have a lot of competition.
Well, one thing kind of in the back of my mind, I am thinking like there are people who are definitely listening to the show who are like, okay, less hunters, buck quality's going up.
Sounds pretty appealing. Just gotta get used to not seeing some deer.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I look at some of our other data, and hopefully we'll talk about hunter movements, et cetera. But you looked at these vast areas where there's nobody hunting, essentially, and so you can get back into areas that some of these bucks haven't seen a human.
We're about to get.
Let's just. I kind of want to get on that a little bit.
I want to ask about one more habitat thing because we're about to go down the rabbit hole on that. You mentioned that in some of these areas, the only cover available would be your mountain laurel and rhododendron thickets. I mean, what level of habitat is that for deer? I mean, it provides cover, but is it doing anything else for them? Like, is that good habitat or is it not good habitat?
Well, also it's not providing good cover. Let me just debunk that a little bit, because if you get into those stands, deer still eat it, in particular mountain laurel. It's really low protein levels, so it's kind of like starvation food is what we term it as deer biologists, but it still has a browse line. And then the rhododendron along the creek courses, it's grown to such a degree. It's not like this little, this stick thin rhododendron. We're talking about rhododendron the size of a man's thigh, and there's no understory because nothing else can grow underneath it. And there's no rhododendron leaves for at least a couple feet. And so if you're a bear, you can crawl in there and you can have, nice cover and all that stuff. But if you're a fawn in there, the bears are crawling through and coyotes are coming through, and they don't have a lot of competition having to see through leaves, etc. And so it's not great cover for deer. It's not great forage for deer. It provides some cover. It makes it a little difficult for hunters to get through it, but for predators, it's dynamite for them looking for fawns.
It sounds like a scary place to be a fawn.
Yeah.
Bears crawling around in thickets.
It's like the Coliseum, you're going to die. It's just how do you want to die?
Oh my gosh. That's terrible. That's terrible. So really, I mean, because we've been to some of these areas and there's like complete absence of any cover, like besides I guess the mountain laurel is just really the only thing that they have. And there's not really an alternative.
Unless you get some storms come through and get some storm damage. Like, that's the one thing. Like, you get in some of those areas, big thunderstorm. Like, I don't know if y'all have many tornadoes in that area. But it's like you get a big snow. Like, you probably don't deal with a lot of ice down here, even up there. But,
right.
Something to break some trees down to get more sunlight to the ground is like you find little pockets of it, and that's like it. Like blown down trees for the most part.
Yeah, and so like you're kind of like in this tip and mound ecosystem where a big tree falls over and its root ball comes up, and normally that gap would be filled by regeneration, but still deer are hammering those areas because there's just not a lot of forage, and so it will be a gap, but often it's just an empty gap. And so you need it on a large scale, a lot of trees coming down. I will say the Forest Service has used some more intensive fire and growing season fire that tends to be a little bit more, have a better ability to punch through that canopy and kill some trees and get some sunlight to the forest floor. So where they're applying fire across broad areas, especially during the growing season, they can have some success with getting some growth.
So before we move on to the GPS stuff and the hunter movements and everything, if there's someone listening to this who's fired up and they don't like the way that the Forest Service is managing these properties, what are some things that they can do?
Yeah, well, everything that's done by the Forest Service is transparent, I have to say. I know people think the government does everything in a black box somewhere, but and I just saw a request for public comment on habitat management on the Chattahoochee National Forest. And so there are public meetings. They put in for scoping documents are available online so people can see what the Forest Service is planning to do. And if hunters and other enthusiasts that have consumptive values, anglers, etc., they can comment on this. But guess who's commenting on it? Forest Watch and their contingent. And so we need to get out there and have that voice to say, hey, we want to see this timber harvest go through.
Is there any nonprofit group on our side of things who's doing a decent job of that, whether it be National Deer Association, NWTF, RGS, Quail Forever? Is anybody doing a decent job with that?
Oh, I've seen multiple times where NDA, National Deer Association, encourages their membership to speak out. They give good information on the subject, and so it's digestible by us in a quick setting so we can understand where we stand on the issue, and they let us know about public meetings. Also, backcountry hunters and anglers do a good job of keeping their finger on the pulse of what Forest Service is doing.
Okay.
So I'll say this: the only issue I see with what hunters and this like outdoor communities maybe not doing compared to the opposition is it seems like the opposition is way more organized and way more structured. Because deer hunters aren't that organized, not that structured. Like it doesn't like we had our CAB meeting, our Conservation Advisory Board meeting in Alabama where they're talking about legislation, policy changes, stuff like that when it comes to hunters and anglers. And, put a little call out on the podcast. We had some people show up, and it had a good turnout, but it was only like 60 to 80 people. This is a statewide meeting. And I actually talked to one of the board members who listens to our podcast, and he was saying, he's like, if y'all want stuff changed, we need hundreds of people being here, like putting pressure. He's like, I agree, because I had different thoughts on things. And he's like, I'm agreeing. I kind of understand what you're saying, but he's like, to get everybody else here, you got to put pressure on them. Like you have to have the numbers show up and those voices being heard. And that's like the only thing is like organizing and getting enough of those kind of people to show up at some of these events, the live events specifically, to really make a difference. So it's like we're trying to do that more so with some of our CAB meetings in Alabama and trying to organize like next ones that are coming up, trying to, get more listeners and us to go show up and just, let our voices be heard. But it's like you almost need that in all these different states, especially when it comes to, if you're wanting better habitat and specifically better hunting opportunities on, some of these pieces of public land in the mountains, you need a voice to be out there to get everybody organized and show up to these events.
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go. I mean, it's great. Those that show up, I've been to plenty of these meetings as a hunter as well as professionally, and it's very low attendance, and there are a lot of squeaky wheels that represent other interests. So that's great to be there. But really, we need not a legislative arm. We need a lobbying arm. We need to be in the ear of legislators. We also need a legal arm. I mean, when I say I'm speaking as a hunter now, by the way. But when we have really strong legal interests like the Southern Environmental Law Center that's going against. Now, environmental is a word that we can, all right, we all like the environment, right? But it's that cessation of timber harvest is what they're interested in, or any uses that are anything besides just allowing the forest to be there. We as consumptive users need to be legally represented. We need to be able to combat that. And that's where it takes funding and organization. I don't know what that looks like exactly. So I think it's great that you all get the word out there and you get folks to those meetings, but we do need organization and we need legal representation.
And it's also hunter education too, because to bring back the example of Bridgestone, hunters did show up to that meeting and they shot themselves directly in the foot.
Oh.
So they were the ones against the timber harvest, and they were gonna do good things for that place. And the deer hunters were upset because they were cutting the oaks out,
But the whole, I think it's like 27,000 acres is all oaks. I mean, that's like, It's oak hickory forest. The whole thing is. And, I think they're proposing to cut I think it was 3,000 acres and do part of it in a savanna cut. And the other part was just true grasslands and manage it with fire and everything. And they were like, absolutely not. Like, where's the turkeys going to go? It was funny because our buddy Nick went to it and he was like, man, there was turkey hunters there complaining about because they want to kill turkeys in the hardwoods. and they didn't think anything about the nesting habitat, like just
Right.
not educated on it or don't understand that aspect of the habitat. And same thing for fawning cover, and also just abundance of food sources and having insects that poults need too to be able to grow
Absolutely.
fast when they hatch. So it's amazing, and it's amazing that there's a lot of people out there. Or not a lot. There's hunters out there that don't understand that aspect of the habitat. It's just more so like I just want a certain opportunity, but they don't understand the opportunity cost of what needs to take place in order to make it even better than what they're currently used to.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this, fawn survival, and one of the things we found, which by the way, we didn't talk about some of these vital rates that we saw, but our fawn survival rates were some of the lowest documented in the U.S. And so we're talking about 16% of fawns survive. That's normal rates are in the 40 to 60% range across the country, greater in agricultural areas where there's abundant food, et cetera. But 16% some of the lowest that we've seen in the U.S. And those fawns that live near food plots or wildlife openings, their first 30 days of life, they had better survival. But after that, it was almost a sink because there's so little open habitat that the predators congregate there. And so those fawns that normally would have made it beyond 30 days and in most areas of the country would have been fine, lived their lives, they were succumbing to coyote predation later in life.
Interesting, man. That's terrible.
So yeah, if we think of our listeners here, not they're my listeners too, but today they are. It's ours, right? But if you think of listeners who manage their own habitat, and you have a few shooting food plots, and those food plots, when you're not there shooting deer over them, are used by does to raise their fawns, and they're small in size, it's so easy for predators to search those. And I've caught hundreds of fawns on the ground. When I was an undergrad, I used to be in much better shape chasing fawns down. I spent 4 summers just chasing fawns. And I can tell you, in good, complex, early successional open habitats, it's really difficult to catch fawns. And we had some track stars on our teams. In open habitats, hardwood forests catch them all day long. Human beings are catching them all day long.
Like you're running out literally catching a fawn.
Even you guys could catch them.
I don't know. Might tear me an ACL or something. They start going side to side.
I'm just giving you a hard time since you're throwing shade at me. But what I'm saying is that as a college student, if we went to a property that was managed for deer, right, let's hit those food plots because they're going to be in them. And we almost don't even have to look anywhere else. It's a sink, and the predators are keyed the same way. We did a coyote study in South Carolina on recursive movements of coyotes. That means they just keep returning to areas. Guess where they keep returning? These open areas. And if the open areas are small versus the 3,000 acres that were proposed to be cut and managed as grasslands in Tennessee, if they're small, they're going to kill them all day long. It's like going to the convenience store, in and out. Versus going to Costco, it's a little bit harder to find what you need there because they want you there shopping, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
Don't get me going. My wife knows how I feel about Costco. Are they one of your sponsors?
Oh,
No.
not anymore.
All right. Are we good on the habitat stuff?
Yeah, I want to get into the actual.
I want some comments on the habitat stuff.
How I'd like to start the hunter participation and like what hunters were really focusing on and kind of like the areas they weren't going to. What was the commonality? Just kind of kick us out. What was the commonality of places hunters were not getting into based off the GPS data?
Yeah, well, I want to preface this by saying I don't think hunters are lazy because I'm one of them, right? But you're talking about areas that are vast. Think about WMAs that are 50,000 acres. They're rugged, and the roads are on the ridges. They tend to be anyhow. And that's where hunters are. They have to park somewhere, right? And they have limited time to hunt during these just several day firearms hunts. And so hunters are parking on the ridges. They're walking out ridges, and that's where they're hunting. They're also targeting food plots as well. And so generally speaking, they're close to roads. They are on areas that are high elevation. They're targeting deciduous forests, so think oak groves. And that was very predictable across our study sites. And so we instrumented hunters, giving them GPS units and asking them to turn them on, asking them to carry them throughout their hunt. So we're able to look at how long they hunted, where they hunted, how far they traveled, how long they were on stand. and then what habitats and ruggedness, et cetera, that they use. So I'm prefacing all that, and I'll take your questions to solidify what we saw in those vast refuge areas that we identified.
So road access being on top of the ridges, they stayed on top of the ridges, walking ridges out. So I'm guessing there was a large void. If someone had a drop in elevation and maybe come up another side where there wasn't road access, there wasn't many people doing that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So on the scale of hunters were using about 5% of these WMAs. So you're talking on a 50,000 acre WMA as an example, only 5% of it on average is being hunted. So if you can just get away from the road, think a mile or more, go down in elevation, back up, especially back down again, and you go up again, you're definitely away from everybody. But clearly, I think it's pretty recent that some of us are starting to pack deer out on our back, right? And that gives you a little bit more ability. Now, if you're dragging uphill, I'll tell you, I've drug a lot of deer, but it's rough business, and that's where our hunters have heart attacks and get themselves into issues. And so I can understand not wanting to go far, especially if you're going back to camp and you're having that, especially the mountain experience with your hunting buddies and family. You want to get back to camp. And that's what we saw was that hunters were having essentially 2, we call them hunting bouts per day, but they're taking a stand, hunting in the morning, going back to camp, and then going back out in the evening. And so if you're tied to that going back and forth twice a day, it's limited how far you're going to travel to hunt your deer. And that's what, by and large, most people were doing, those that we had instrumented with GPS units anyhow.
Interesting. So that, to me, as a listener or viewer of the show, would give me more confidence. If you could build your confidence of, hey, it's going to physically be very demanding, mentally it's going to be very demanding as well when you're spending, like, if you can spend all day out there and cover that ground and just, like you said, drop an elevation, come up the other side, and if you drop elevation again, you're going to put yourself way away from where majority of the hunters are going to be at.
Right. My advice would be, if you're a hunter, as our hunters, we saw they keyed in on those oak groves in particular, those oak stands that we're producing. Get out there and scout those stands. I mean, what we're seeing now is we're having a good mast year, particularly in the Piedmont here. But get out, identify those stands that are producing right now. And, it might be a little farther in, but you're unlikely to shoot multiple deer anyway, right? And so you're targeting getting one deer, a quality deer, having a quality experience. Getting further out there and setting for the day is much better than being close to the road and having lower success and being, really bumping elbows with other hunters because everybody's along the roads.
Was there a distance, like thinking back to some of those, the data that y'all tracked from individuals, was there a certain like average distance they were getting from the roads? Like what was that potentially like?
Yeah, it was really, the range was 3/4 of a mile to 1.5 miles. And generally speaking, it was perpendicular to the roads. And so everybody is parking along the roads and going perpendicular. If you go parallel to the road and nobody else can park, let's say it's a steep area where you can't park, you're getting away from people automatically going parallel with the road. And so think they're going 3/4 of a mile to 1.5 miles. They're spending on average 2 hours a day hiking into their spots, in and out of their spots. And so that's eating a little bit of clock for them as well. And so, yeah, you go, everybody's going perpendicular to the road, that general distance from the road. They're staying at high elevation. They're in deciduous forest. Very, very consistent.
So they are walking a good distance, but they're walking, staying high. They're not trying to lose any elevation. So it's really not as an intense of a walk or a trek, but they're covering distances, but it's on maybe easier access, but potentially less used areas based off hunting pressure than where the deer are probably going to be at, which kind of goes into a little bit of what we're all seeing on the data, specifically some of the does y'all had collared, and how they were reacting to that hunting pressure. Because I'm curious if they just lost a bunch of elevation, got way down to some of the bottoms, or they started just crossing ridges, ridge systems, just trying to get away from that pressure.
Well, they didn't even have to try to get away from the pressure and we instrumented those. When I say instrumented, we gave them a GPS collar, so a big old necklace, and we caught a lot of those deer on open areas because it was easier to access and get our trapping there and get our crews there off of roads. But those does didn't necessarily live on those roads and open areas. It was part of their home range. And so we had deer distributed throughout these WMAs. But during the hunts, these does had on average, they'd use about 15 acres a day, which isn't very big. But if you think about our hunters are in those oak groves, the time of year, you're talking about October, November, when acorns are dropping, those deer are really keying on those acorns. So I can see that. They gorge themselves, they bed locally. So about 15 acres a day, and we had 20 does with collars on, and we saw no difference in movement. So like we look at different like tortuosity of their movements. Are they being pushed? What's their step length? Are they running? None of it changed. And the use of we call them utilization distributions, pre-hunt, hunt, and post-hunt, were the same across those periods. So the hunting didn't change the way these does use the landscape. Most of these does weren't impacted by hunters at all. They didn't know that antlerless deer were off. These are all does that we had collared. They didn't know antlerless deer were off the table for harvest. They just weren't being impacted by hunters.
Interesting.
They were using areas that the hunters just weren't accessing? Was that what it was?
They were using areas that hunters weren't accessing, but also hunters were at very low density. It was about 250 acres per hunter. So think about a lease that somebody has, right? A 250 acre piece might have 10 people plus hunting on it. And so very low pressure. But we had does that were in areas where hunters were. They just weren't being impacted highly by them. You know, we did a study for my master's in Savannah Riverside, South Carolina. It's a Department of Energy installation where they process nuclear waste, they produce nuclear products, and they use highly intensive dog hunting and to manage the deer population, keep it at low densities, reduce deer vehicle collisions, and so on. And so they'll put hundreds of dogs in a hunt unit and hundreds of hunters. So a much different strategy. Like we're talking a hunter per 10 or 20 acres and dogs on top of that. But even those does, they stayed in their home ranges whenever possible, even when they were run by dogs. Like when we identified that a particular deer was being run by dogs, they tried to stay in their home range. And then if they got bounced out of their home range, they were back in their home range within 24 hours. They have a really high sight fidelity. So even if they're getting pushed, and study after study shows that when a deer gets bounced out of an area, they're only running like at most 200 yards, and then they're just calming down, and they want to get back to where they were. Even if it's at nightfall, they're going to get back there. Whether it's food, their family, whatever it is, breeding purposes, they want to return to their area.
Now, do you have any insight into how that might be different or the same for bucks?
Yeah, it's very much the same for bucks across studies. Now, we didn't have bucks collared in this North Georgia study, but by and large, they have a high sight fidelity too. They establish a home range and they maintain that home range. Now, certainly they're looking for breeding opportunities. They're feeding as well, but they're going to use it the same. And even in dog hunting, bucks that were instrumented, not on my study, but on other studies, they try to maintain that home range. If they got bounced out of it, they return pretty quickly.
Interesting. So even with dog hunting pressure, where they're literally getting, because man, you want to talk about something that fires people up. It's dog hunting as just a subject. But even in dog hunting, where I mean they've got literally a pack of dogs chase them out of their bedding area, they still want to get back to that same bedding area.
They're going to get back to that bedding area usually within 13 hours, is what the exact metric we found was in South Carolina. So you might as well go hunt them the next day. We recommended that for those hunts where they were trying to reduce deer densities, particularly along roadways, keep hunting them. Don't just hunt them in the morning. Hunt them the morning, afternoon, and the next morning so you can kill more deer. But they generally didn't. And you can think about most hunters, it's like, oh, I bounced those deer. I'm not going to go back. I'm going to give it some rest. Those deer are back right in there.
Okay, that's what I was getting at. The bump and dump tactic, guys. Have you ever heard of that? Like, go bump a buck out of his bed and set back up on him and kill him when he comes back.
That's one of the things my dad taught me. He's like, okay, if we bounce them, we're going to just wait them out. They're going to come back, especially if we bounce them out of their bed and we get between their bed and a feeding area. We're going to get them on that same trail. And, It's a test of patience, but it sure works.
So that is so interesting because growing up, you always heard like you don't want to booger up the deer, you don't want to bust them out of their area, you don't want to have them shift, anything like that. And the GPS stuff is just so cool because it lends insight into what the deer are actually doing. And so to me, it sounds like when you go bump that buck and maybe you quit seeing him. Maybe you don't get him on camera anymore. It's not that he left and he like literally went to the next property and he's living somewhere else. Maybe he just adjusted his pattern to avoid you, right?
Yeah, there's some nice studies in Oklahoma and in other areas that show that buck's literally just like out of range of you. And like some of these intricate movement studies is that he knows these established stands, especially if you've got a big tower stand on a food plot or something like that. And he's avoiding it by just adjusting his movements a little bit, but also they do go nocturnal, or they'll be at the touches of dawn and dusk. And so you booger him, if you will, but adjust yourself a little bit. He's still in the area, and you can still wear him down.
Okay, interesting. So what does you kind of got me going down a little rabbit hole. Wait, what were you going to say?
I was going to bring up nocturnal.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay, I'll let you run with it.
So when you say, I feel like I've heard conflicting things on this because growing up it was always he went nocturnal, like you're never going to see him in the daylight, and then later on it's like, well, they're not actually nocturnal, they're still getting up and moving, it's just in a smaller area. What is your take on what the deer's actually doing? Because he's not like laying there for like 13 hours, right?
Well, I mean, sometimes he is, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, he's laying, he might get up, from his day bed and feed a little bit locally and then bed back down. If he's not in his breeding mode, if you will, right? Breeding mode brings everything out. But in a highly pressured situation, like there was a good study on a muzzleloader hunt in Nebraska that showed that those deer, essentially they went nocturnal. They weren't moving during the day. They were avoiding that pressure. And, come time when the bell rings and you're not allowed to hunt anymore, they're up and moving again. And, we can look at Connecticut studies where really highly pressured hunts in state parks, they go nocturnal.
Okay. Did you have something else on the nocturnal?
No, but that's an aspect I'm really curious on because, I've heard in the past, just talking to hunters, like, bucks go nocturnal. And then, talked to a couple biologists and like they're kind of moving around, but it's like in a very tight little spot where like if you're not within that small buffer area, it might be 100-yard circle that they're using their daylight. Essentially, they're nocturnal. Like, yeah, they're moving, but it's in such a small area. If you're not on that X, you're not going to be able to see that deer at all. And, like, you won't get him on a camera until after dark when he kind of starts cruising around and going to food sources, whatever, which is just fascinating because it's something that I feel like a lot of people worry about, especially, like, private land guys that don't have a lot of property to hunt. Maybe, they got a couple hundred acres or less. They're really worried about, again, bumping deer, maybe them relocating, which we've talked about. They kind of come back to the same area, but also potentially causing a buck or some of the deer to go nocturnal, in quotes, where they're just not moving a whole bunch and they just have loss of opportunity. So is that something, how quickly, just I'm curious on this, if you know any of the data points, how quickly does it take a deer or in general to revert back to a more natural pattern from like that hunting pressure and the nocturnal aspect?
Yeah, I don't have any of my own data, but I know from reading other studies, it's pretty quick. It's like within a week or something like that, a couple days of pressure being off, they're back to it. And during the breeding season, I'm going to say it's all thrown out the window is that he's going to continue to move. And so it's an encouragement to, maybe break from your routine and squirrel him out wherever he may be. I like other podcasts and shows, but Dan Infalt, the hunting beast, he's like, I gridded out every 10 acres and I just drew out of a hat. Or I don't fully remember the details, but like we get in our patterns of getting to our stand the same way, and those deer learn those patterns. If we're running ATV in there, they're hearing that, they're knowing those patterns. If we break from our patterns, we might be able to break his pattern of being nocturnal and just locked down in an area.
Oh, that's fascinating. That makes a ton of sense. Also, I'm just curious with you. You being in the deer research field, how long have you been in this field, by the way?
Well, since I'm 18, I'm 45, so whatever the years are.
Okay, I hear you. So, with you being in the field, and you mentioned you're a public land hunter. How has your research and your experiences through being in deer research kind of shaped your hunting strategy?
Well, I mainly study people like you guys that hunt on public land. That's what fascinates me most is where the hunters are moving, what they're thinking. But honestly, looking at the deer data, the deer movement data, what it does is it lends confidence to me. They're there. They're going. Or if they're not there, they're going to be there in a day or two. They're gonna cycle back through that area. If it's part of their home range, particularly if you think it's their core area. Let's say you have cameras out on public land, and you're just getting this buck repeatedly on camera, and you got a couple cameras nearby. You've got him figured out. You're in his core area. You just have to be there when he comes through. And so personally, and it goes back to some of what my dad taught me, is that patience. We stay on stand all day long. I do a lot of my best reading on stand. Now, I'm sure I missed opportunities, but if I have enough snacks and I have the will to sit there all day, it has paid off more times than not. And you see all kinds of other great stuff when you're in the stand. And if we go back to our hunter data, I want those folks that are going back for lunch to see their camp, camp mates, because they're going to push deer to me, and that's what pays off for me. So if I have an area that I'm confident in, I know it's got all that the deer needs. It's got the food, cover, etc. And it's got pressure that's maybe especially adjacent to it, but not right within it. I'm going to stick with it if I know those deer are there. And if it's, say, a high-intensity quota hunt, which I really enjoy some of those too, it breaks things up in the fall, I want to know there's 250 other folks out there. And I love figuring out where they're going to be because I'm likely not going to be there. But I will be adjacent to them, and I'm going to use them to my advantage.
Hey, y'all's quota hunts are wild.
I love it.
I've only been on one of them, but it was wild.
Just get elevated. You're good.
There's a bunch of people out there.
You talk about Dan Info, okay?
Okay, yeah.
And, he talks a lot about buck beds in that marsh country that he hunts a lot in Wisconsin. Are you familiar with any data or studies done in any of the Appalachian mountains, looking at specific bedding sites for either does or bucks or anything that's been looked at from that aspect?
Yeah, not so much. I mean, we don't have great data on bedding in particular for some of these studies because we try to preserve battery life of these collars. So we're getting usually at most 6 locations a day. But we had a great study in Florida where we had higher frequency locations. And, those bucks were bedding. They were spending almost all day bedding, getting up like we were talking about, moving around a little bit to feed and bedding back down, and then moving at dawn and dusk, and then throughout the night. But I can't relate the habitat to Florida, to North Georgia whatsoever. We're talking about Central Florida. But I can relate our study in Arkansas and the Ozarks to North Georgia. And what we saw was that deer that used more rough and rugged terrain had higher survival. So they were not only getting away, because the 2 greatest sources of mortality in our Arkansas study are hunter harvest. They're taking about a third of the deer, and coyotes, and then CWD, I should mention. But those deer that survived at a higher rate and for longer in life, for more years of life, were in those rough and rugged areas. And, I mean, take that to North Georgia, right? Most hunters strolling down the ridge lines, the spines, right? Get to those rugged areas because deer are happy to bed in them.
Yeah, that makes sense too. If there's no habitat cover, I guess that's kind of terrain cover.
Yeah, you're getting your sight line obstructed, from predators, and you're going to win because you're going to set yourself right with the wind. You're going to hear them coming because it's probably going to be rough to get through there, and then you get to where you can see them as well. And as a deer, you're winning that one.
Could you give us examples of what you mean by rough and rugged in some of that country?
In Arkansas, I mean, areas that if you take a step, you'll fall off to your death. I mean, cliffs, areas that have intricate rock formations, poor soils, just folds in the terrain, if you will, like very frequent wrinkles in the terrain. And so they tend to be high elevation on faces, but they're just intricate landscape features.
When you say poor soils, my mind immediately goes to something like a glade, possibly. Is that what y'all saw?
In Arkansas, the poor soils are like you're walking on rocks like they're marbles because the soil is mostly rock. It's highly eroded soil, and just it's more rock than it is soil.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, that's something that we've seen just traveling around. Like we've hunted Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and Arkansas, and we see that actually pretty consistently. Like no matter what state we're in, we're gonna be in North Carolina next week, and that's what we're gonna be looking for. Is that pretty much what you're talking about? Like it's like a really steep face, and usually I'm a map nerd, so I'm always just looking at the maps like a lot more than I should, and I kind of like think myself into a hole. But when I'm looking at these maps in these mountainous areas, you'll find something that's like incredibly steep on the map, and you can see that there's like a difference in the not only the terrain but the actual habitat there. Usually, like there'll be more coniferous trees that you can see in the imagery, or you can see rocks through the imagery.
Right.
And we usually end up picking up some deer there. Now it's incredibly hard to hunt because it's like a castle. I mean, it's literally like a castle, and trying to get in on that. Have you started keying in on things like that? Just, I'm curious of your own experience here.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak generally, but these contours
can I have some coordinates?
I will never share. I'm touching my phone. You touch my Onyx points, I'll tell you what. My wife will say, do you have a girlfriend? I'm like, and I'll show her, and it's Onyx.
You're like over in the corner with your wife. You're like, I don't know if I can trust you.
But yeah, if we start down, let's say at a foothill, and it's a cove. It starts as a cove and comes up and it comes to a finger, and you see those contours getting narrower and narrower and narrower. And then at the top, it's rugged, and like you're saying, it's often rocky, and it's a pinch point closer to the higher elevation. That's kind of money, because that deer's at its castle. I challenge you to come up here and get here before me, or whatever it may be.
Oh, that's epic. That's pretty cool. Another thing I've heard about these more mountainous areas, especially in the Appalachian Mountains, we've interviewed guys from Eastern Tennessee, North Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia, West Virginia, like all the way up. One thing that I've heard pretty consistently is some of the more successful guys that we talk to actually say stay away from the tops of the mountains. Like the more upper elevation, you want to stay away from that. And that's even in areas where I don't think there's a ton of roads necessarily. And they tell you to focus more on the side slopes. Do you think that could be more of a habitat thing, or more of just a straight up hunting pressure thing, kind of like you were talking about earlier?
I think it can also be, who wants to be skylined, and deer doesn't want to be skylined as much. But yeah, I mean, they're definitely side hilling. I mean, we see that in our data, is that they're going along the contours as well. But really, I guess I would call it a point of money. A money point would be those saddles, and you'll see them coming up these rugged areas and just going wherever that depression is. They're topping that ridge there. I mean,
dude,
did I just give it all away for you?
No. You just described a spot.
No, I want to get more. I know.
I mean, yeah. Look, I'm thinking about December.
You're so selfish.
I know.
God.
But
Dude,
let me
there's a spot.
fly back down here to the Piedmont, which is not as rugged. I mean, I see on certain public lands that people hunt that even just a small feature like that, even though it's not rugged, the deer always takes the path of least resistance, and it's still those little areas that are just a little bit easier to get through. And especially if it's on an old logging road or something like that, and it goes up through that gap, if you will, they're going to use it.
Okay.
So that's what I wanted to get into specifically, is how deer use certain, based off GPS data you've seen, how they use certain terrain features. We talk about that a bunch, and we interview a lot of guys who hunt much more mountains, and that they love topo maps and kind of figuring out how deer use them. So of course you're saying saddles get high usage, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this. Do you think there's a correlation between saddle usage, deer crossing through saddles or walking along saddles, where there's not much hunting pressure, versus areas, and I don't know if this is more a theory, not like I say probably has been studied, because there's some areas we've had guests on that, like, dude, if you go to saddle, you're going to find tree stands there. Like, it's like they're so commonly hunted in certain areas where there's not abundance of them. There's very select few in certain mountain ranges or ridge systems, and like guys just naturally want to go hunt there. And because of that, some of the guests talk about like the deer don't necessarily seem to use it like they would in other areas where it's a little bit less hunting pressure. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can't say that we can negate it with our data, but we saw that these deer still had very resilient home ranges and were using these features. And so when they're using a saddle, they're transiting between other areas. It's not like that's their destination. And so they're still coming out of this broader area. And the land and the GPS data kind of show it. You can see them being sucked through. It's like a little vacuum. It still guides them to it. And if you've got a buck that's looking for does, et cetera, he's still sucked through those terrain features, and he's not of the right mind anyway to think about it. And I guess what I would say is our data don't necessarily show that they stop using it. I can't say whether there's tree stands or not. This is public land with concentrated hunts, but from what I saw, they're still using those features.
What other, like, I kind of want to ask you about other features and see if there's anything y'all have seen in the data, how deer use them. How do deer in like more mountainous areas use like those more subtle ditch and drainages? That kind of run up the side of a slope, like not like the big, not like an well, they're not cutting timber, so there's no SMZs.
Right, yeah.
But not the big drainages going up, but all these secondary drainages kind of run up the side of the ridges. Do you see deer using those much on data?
Yeah, so what we see is the major streams, like the kind of primary, secondary streams, are really important to them. We see a lot of fawn bedding down there as well. But across the year, they're using those, and they're coming up those secondary drainages. But don't think of them coming necessarily right up the center, like right up the creek. They're still side hilling up those drainages. And those that are a more significant water course, not just, kind of an ephemeral one, they're using those more often. Probably there's better forage there. Even in the summertime, it's cooler.
I'm thinking of other terrain features and how deer might, use them and see if y'all seen anything on the study. Have you seen anything about bench usage, like benches along the side of ridges or mountains, like how deer use those at all?
I can't go by the data and say, hey, yeah, we're seeing them use those in particular. We didn't parse anything out that closely.
Was there any other terrain features that you did notice like usage on?
I will say that they did use the early successional habitats, the openings, the food plots. That's where hunters were as well, but they used them throughout the year. So I'm not trying to say that's where to key in on as a hunter, but they are getting used by deer. So maybe if you're going to hunt those areas early in the quota hunt or whatever it may be, it'd be good to get on them, but hunters key in on them as well. Otherwise, yeah, I can't speak to any, beyond what we've talked about, anything significant that we picked up on.
Yeah, that's a unique thing as well. These like highly concentrated, like pretty intense hunts, y'all's quota hunts. The place I hunted was a couple thousand acres, and they gave out 200 permits. Mm-hmm. And I think only maybe about 130 showed up for the hunt. But dude, it was something. I mean, there was people there, but like that burst of like super intense hunting pressure, kind of out of nowhere. What do you think that does from like just the deer standpoint, opposed to something more like my hunting club in Alabama, where it's just pretty consistent pressure? Like there's a couple guys who are hunting it pretty much every single Saturday, maybe one weekday. There's some people out there hunting, as opposed to a 5-day period where there's like 100 people on this property just hammering it.
I honestly think those highly concentrated hunts, they go right back to their normal patterns, and they're not necessarily affected by what happened during the hunt. Mm-hmm. I think folks going out to a lease and repeatedly using the same areas, deer are acclimating to that and adjusting their movements. But those burst hunts, I think they're just, hey, something big happened here. I kind of shake my head, and when it's over, I go back to it.
Yeah. You also mentioned earlier, kind of on that same thread of high hunting pressure, with the dog hunting in South Carolina. Those deer wanted to stay in their home range, and they would kind of pinball around in there, right, unless they just got absolutely forced out. Did you maybe notice, I don't know if you had this in the data, but maybe you could, take your biologist hat off, put your hunter hat on if you have to. Was there any consistency to the escape routes that they would use? So like, are they just running, trying to get away, or are they still trying to like hit that cover seam, and they're going to hit that edge, and they're going to take that saddle? I mean, do you have any insight onto that?
Yeah, for that study in particular, it was mostly flatlands and big pine plantations, clear cuts, etc. When they bounced out of their home range, there was nothing consistent other than to say they didn't cross major highways or anything like that, or pave roads so much. That was a boundary for them, and we saw those deer set up home ranges that were generally a deer wouldn't set up a home range that was bisected by a paved road. Generally speaking, if they did, they tended to get hit, by the way. But it was adjacent to and generally longitudinal with that road.
Okay. So that's like almost kind of a back wall for them.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. The same thing with rivers, and even when we see deer disperse from their natal range, so they're moving. A young male's moving from where his mom was. Mm-hmm. He's going along those highways and roads as travel corridors before he sets up his next home range.
Okay, very interesting. Now, have you ever noticed any terrain features that tend to act as that back wall that's a feature that a lot of deer will stop at, and it's like a boundary for them? Like maybe it's a highway, maybe it's a river or like a lake or something. Are there any things that have jumped out to you over the years that you've noticed that are like that?
Yeah, I can say that in areas that have highways and rivers, they're definitely traveling along those. But where there's impounded areas or wetland areas, and some of the data shows this, they'll look for that area. They'll pass on the dam side of it, or the area that's a wetland will kind of go out into an area and it'll still be wet and soggy. They're going to the area that's more solid ground by and large to cross that area. So if you've got a beaver dam, for instance, between two ponds, they're going to try to cross in that dam area or an area that tends to be a little bit drier.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Because it's kind of like a natural pinch point.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. That's interesting. I had something else on the dog hunting. What is are you a big dog hunter? Have you dog hunted in the past?
I've never dog hunted for deer. I've got my beagles for rabbit hunting, but it was pretty similar. So we were out. This was before we had GPS collars, by the way. So it was in the early 2000s. So we had VHF, it's radio signal, and you dial in their radio station, you get that deer. And with an antenna, you get the strongest signal and you take a bearing on that signal. So we had people throughout these hunt areas with the antenna and radio units, and we would triangulate deer locations. So I was in on the hunts and got to watch deer run by and hogs run. It's funny to see a 200-pound hog come by and 3 tiny beagles chasing it. But you talk about these quota hunts, now put dogs on top of those quota hunts. That's the intensity that we're talking about. Deer running, so you got deer that are being run by the dogs, and then deer that aren't being run by dogs that are still experiencing that pressure, along with the handlers who are also hunters. They're moving through an area, and those guys, they give a whoop whoop, so they're moving through making sound. Then you got standers, and so to see deer, the intensity. If you look at the map, it's highly intense. There's hunters everywhere, and handlers are putting dogs out everywhere. But those deer are slipping right through them. We're talking about buckshot, by the way, for safety purposes. Mm-hmm. So the deer have to be relatively close to shoot them, but deer are slipping through those hunters.
That's crazy, man.
They're so resilient. They just kind of have a good command of what's going on in their area.
Yeah, and I guess it makes sense that they would want, even in that just absolute like siege, they're still going to want to stay in their home range because they know it like the back of their hand, right?
And those thick areas that they've got that they know they can just wait. You want to talk about my rabbit dogs, I know, so I'll just talk about them. But in where I run them, several areas that I run them, I'll get a chase going with the dogs. We'll bounce a rabbit, and they're running. They're maintaining about 15, 20 acres is what the chase will be contained by. After an hour running, I can't tell you how many times a deer will finally jump up. My dogs don't chase deer whatsoever. The deer will have been in there, and I'm moving around trying to get a look at the rabbit, and I'll bounce a deer that's been inside of that chase the entire time.
Yeah. We've rabbit hunt a decent bit with somebody's got dogs on public, and we get in pine thickets, like 10, 12-year-old pine stands.
Yeah.
That's got some thick cover in it, but like you can kneel down, you can kind of shoot underneath some of that stuff. And I've been there one time in that situation, and the dogs are not 80 yards from me, and these two does just start walking right towards me. They're between me and the dog. I mean, the deer,
Oh, yeah.
40 yards, and they're just walking. They don't care.
And they're watching, and their ears are turning.
Yeah, but they're just like, oh, okay, cool. And they literally walk right by me at like probably 15, 20
Yep.
yards. And I'm like, they just like did not care. Like they didn't come tearing out there running or anything like that. It's just like, they're like, oh, whatever.
It's great scouting for deer, actually. I mean, because like I said, my dogs don't chase deer, so if we bounce deer, fine. And then I'm marking points as we're hunting. It's very enjoyable.
Well, our buddy,
Yeah.
Mr. Benny, he killed a hammer last year.
Yeah, on some Alabama public that we rabbit hunt, and he ended up getting his own rabbit dogs, and he's only got 2 or 3 that he'll just take out by himself, or maybe him and just one guy. And he's like, I'm out there shooting rabbits, and I'm finding my bucks.
Oh, yeah. I agree fully with them.
Yeah, we ought to do a whole podcast with him about that. He would go down, not to be punny, but the rabbit hole on that,
Yeah.
dude, big time.
Okay.
He's a big and before that too. Also, he's squirrel hunting to do the same thing. This public that we hunt, it used to be mostly upland hardwoods, and it eventually all got cut. Like literally, the whole place got cut. Now it's a bunch of pine thickets. But back then, he was doing the same thing, but with squirrel hunting, and he would locate deer and. I mean, he'd go in there and kill them. Like, he was real good at it.
Yeah, my best scouting, unfortunately, turkey populations are quite low in Georgia, especially on the public land I hunt. So turkey hunting has become my deer scouting because I cover so much land. I just look now at OnX and I say, where have I not hunted this area? And that's where I'm going to turkey hunt.
Hey, another thing, in those big woods settings that are closed canopy, those roads, there's no disturbance, right? There's no clear cuts. There's no fire or anything like that.
There's some fire, just not much. And It's
Okay.
very concentrated. They wouldn't return fire usually within 5 years of a previous fire.
Okay. So really in some of those areas, the roads are like kind of some disturbance, right? I mean, you have a road cut on a ridge top, so I'm assuming there'd be a little bit of diversity there. Do you see deer sucked up to those roads?
In particular during fawning season. And so on roads and power line right-of-ways, et cetera, anything that's open, those fringe areas, we're seeing deer. So our fawn bed sites were concentrated in those areas in particular. And then those food plot and opening areas that I talked about. But it's still so limited. You know, the fringe of what you see on a road in national forest, there's very little vegetation, but it's just enough to maintain a little bit of forage for them, a little bedding cover.
Yeah, it's a little bit more than the whole surrounding forest, right?
But nothing, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of compounds the whole predator issue as well, because like I'm not a big trapper or anything, but I used to trap coyotes, and that's where you put your traps is on the road intersections because they just walk the roads, right?
Yeah, especially those transient coyotes. They're using the roads. And there you are. You got your protein along the way to keep you going on the marathon.
A little protein bar on the side of the road. That's terrible.
No. I know we're coming up on time here. Is there anything else we've missed data-wise, or any interesting points or findings that you've had that is worth maybe noting?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of encapsulate that North Georgia project, so we got what I've called vital rates, the survival of adult deer, which was pretty high. Over 85% of our adult does were living. Some of them were dying from disease and other reasons, or getting killed off property on private land. We see really low fawn survival. We see but normal fawn production. And so even though, you know, there are fewer deer, they're still producing about twins for adult does. And so I should mention that there were 3 grad students on the project. Adam Edge, he's now the Tennessee state deer biologist. Jackie Rosenberger, she's the elk biologist in Virginia. And Cheyenne Yates they did the bulk of this work. I'm here to talk about it. But Adam modeled, so he used a statistical technique to model what the population would look like across time. So we know where we're at. It kind of sucks, if you will. Where do we go if we apply different management scenarios? And the population currently has been reducing about 4% per year. So if that continues, we're going to have very, very few deer there. If we remove antlerless harvest, which Georgia DNR already did, we're still seeing a decreasing population trend. Fawn survival has to increase. It's a sensitive parameter, as we call it. It has to increase if this population is to be sustained or increase. And from what we're seeing, I mean, you're not going to trap predators at any large scale. They have bear hunting there. It's a 2-bear limit, and still folks aren't taking that great amount of bears out to have an effect on the deer population. And so really it comes down to habitat for us. If this habitat's not improved, we're not going to be able to maintain deer populations and that recreational opportunity. So it is a sad story still. I think that the good news is that it can all be turned, and I am seeing where the Forest Service is starting to cut more, and that can turn the table there.
Will it get to a point where it just hits where it bottoms out and sustains at a, like, you just get so low that's the carrying capacity? Or, I mean, is it gonna get to the point where they would have to potentially restock because literally all the deer are dead?
Yeah, it's going to get to a low level. Let's just say 5 deer per square mile and probably maintain itself at that level. We're not likely to restock deer anytime soon, given disease concerns and, just that we know we can turn it with other methods. And I think that we can only hope that things will change in terms of habitat.
So pretty much we can solve it with a chainsaw.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, if you guys drink more whiskey and more barrels are needed, maybe that demand for white oak will go up. And
Oh, there we go. Well, I can help with that.
all for a good cause.
It's all for a good cause.
Yeah. No, awesome. Well, perfect. Well, again, we appreciate you joining us on this podcast. It's been interesting. Let me ask, is there any place that people, listeners or viewers can go to maybe like read some of these studies, like any studies have been published? Like, where would they go to try to find out more information if they want to read about it?
They can visit our website, ugadeerresearch.org. They can also there's a great mechanism in Google. It's Google Scholar. And you can search for studies you can look for Appalachian deer movements, and that'll give you access to not only our studies, but from everywhere else. And you've talked to some of the other professionals in the world. So I encourage that. They can also reach out to me, and if they can't find an article, I've provided them believe me, to North Georgia hunters looking for, hey, what did you guys learn? I want to learn more.
Okay. How would they reach out to you?
If they check out our website, they'll see where I can be contacted.
Okay,
Yep.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, Gina, appreciate you joining us on this podcast. Listeners, thank y'all for listening to this episode. Viewers, appreciate you watching, and we'll catch you back here in the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsmen podcast. Remember, guys, y'all stay Southern.